Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight to one of our first Peoria Reads 2025 programs. We really appreciate having you here. The program that we have really dovetails into our Peoria Reads book. And while I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, know what Peoria Reads is, I don't get paid if I don't give you the whole spiel. So just kidding, but I'll keep it really short. So Peoria Reads is our One City, One Book initiative, where our committee chooses a book that we think will have broad appeal. And this year's book really does. It's Holding the Note, Profiles in Popular Music by David Remnick. David Remnick is the editor of The New Yorker. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, and he has intimate profiles of musical icons over the past 50 years. Names like Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Pavarotti, Paul McCartney, just to name a few. So the reason tonight's program dovetails so well is because it's about Peoria's music and storied past. And we couldn't have a better speaker than Jonathan Wright. Thank you, Jonathan, for being here. So grateful because he's so busy, and you're going to understand why when I tell you a little bit about Jonathan. So Jonathan is an author, researcher, vinyl DJ, and musician. You may know him from the 16 years when he was editor of Peoria Magazine. After that, he has had a long career in marketing and communications for several different companies, including Samantle, and now he's at Ameren, Illinois, as a business marketing manager. He also, I had to write this down because there's no way I would have remembered all this. He's also been a correspondent for WCBU Public Radio. He's been an adjunct instructor at Bradley. He serves on the Peoria City County Joint Commission on Racial Justice and Equity, the Turner Center, one of their advisory boards, the Peoria Symphony Orchestra Board, and the Central Illinois Jazz Society Board. So in his free time, he also researches and writes books. And his first book, which hopefully you're familiar with, was Punks in Peoria. It won statewide recognition. It was Book of the Year by the Illinois Historical Society. He's currently in the midst of writing his second book, which is River City Soul, Uncovering the Hidden Musical History of Peoria, Illinois. It's scheduled to be published in 2027. So he is really in the thick of researching, which is why I'm so grateful that he took some time for us tonight. So please, let's welcome Jonathan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I really appreciate it. Okay, gotta stay in front of the camera here. So if you know me, a lot of you know me, I'm a music guy, love music. It's kind of, taken over my life a long time ago. I was in a band, vinyl collector. I have 10,000 records at home. I'm a DJ. I worked at a record store when I was going to Bradley University. And so when I was going to Bradley, I worked at Co-op Records in East Peoria. I might have sold you some records. And I was there for 2.5 years. And during that time, I met a lot of people who I'm still really close with, good friends, bands. And I was there, I was only there a couple of months before I started talking with folks and ended up promoting shows, renting out Legion halls, and started a record label, and did that for a couple of years. This is the biggest show that I ever did, 1995, a band from Washington, D.C. called Fugazi. Brought them in at Expo Gardens, and we had 900 people. And a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to have to move on due to time. But just kind of wanted to show a little bit on my first book. So all of those activities is what led me to Punks in Peoria. And I co-wrote this book with my friend Dawson Barrett. He called me one day in 2013 and said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in writing a book about the punk rock scene that we all kind of came up in and grew up in, and kind of gave us a lot of our values and whatnot. And it was something I'd actually considered in the past, but I never would have done it on my own. So the fact that he called me and invited me in to do this, and he was already a published author, so he already kind of had that in. So I said yes. And 7 years later, the book came out. and so we did 75, 80 interviews for that. It surprising to me, it won the Illinois State Historical Society Book of the Year. It was pretty incredible. We didn't know when we went to the awards ceremony, we thought we were getting an honorable mention. We walk into the table and open up the program, and there, it says Book of the Year. And I was just like flabbergasted because I was in a room of scholars and professors, and it was just really, really honored that something that was kind of out of left field was honored in that way. And so in addition to the book, we also put together a compilation album featuring some of the bands from the book. And we also did a festival. So if you know me, you know that I like to go big. And this was the one time I was going to do this. So we put together this record. On the right is the inner sleeve of the album. And those are the bands that are featured on the album. They're all from Peoria. On the left is a very small version of a very large poster featuring a bunch of flyers from these punk rock shows from the 90s. And when I say punk rock, I don't just mean the Mohawk guys. This also encompasses indie rock and ska and all kinds of different types of styles that played. But everybody was kind of underground at that time. And so when I was researching for that book, the very first chapter of that book kind of sets the stage for the rest of, for the rise of punk rock, which in Peoria came here in right around 1982, 83, in terms of when the first band played a show here, first Peoria band. And so I did a lot of research into the history of rock and roll in Peoria, going back to the 50s and 60s. And, I learned a lot about this place called Beatty's Barn. If you've ever been out, it's just north of Detweiler Park. The barn is still there. And in the 70s, in the early 70s, for a couple of years, they had rock and roll shows there. And a lot of amazing bands played there. The Allman Brothers, King Crimson, Fleetwood Mac, MC5. Dozens of bands played there in this very short window of time in the early 70s. Jay Goldberg was one of the concert promoters who put these shows on. These were the first shows that he did. He got his start doing this at Beatty's Barn. So I was very interested in that. But what interested me more was what I discovered as I was researching, that 10 years before that, they had a bunch of R&B and soul bands that played out at Beatty's Barn. So in the early 60s, James Brown played here before he was, a huge star. Ike and Tina Turner, Sam Cooke, Bobby Blue Bland, Johnny Taylor, all of these R&B acts who are now like classic bands played out at Beatty's Barn. There was very little in the newspaper. And I was amazed to find this out because I'm a local history buff. I'm a music guy. And I was like, how did I never know this? I couldn't believe it. And so I always wanted to write an article. This was when I was still at the magazine. I was going to write an article about Beatty's Barn because I'm like, this is history that people need to know about. But the magazine ended, and I never was able to get around to writing that article. But it always kind of stuck in the back of my head. And then it was last summer, June of 2024. It was actually on Juneteenth. The Journal Star published an article about Beatty's Barn. Great article, very well written, well researched, but it only talked about the rock and roll bands that played there in the 70s. And there was no mention of the R&B acts that played there in the 60s. And I don't think that, whoever wrote that article was, intended for that omission by any means, but it just goes to show that this history has been buried. And it was never documented in the first place. These are the only two ads that I've been able to find that were in the Journal Star. And but I know there were dozens of other shows out there. If you the top one there and the far right are from Booker T and the MGs. You're probably familiar with Green Onions and pretty big band back in the day. They were booked at Beatty's Barn. They ended up not showing up, and some sort of riot ensued, which was documented in the Journal Star and in the Bloomington Pantograph, but it also made its way all the way to Ebony Magazine. So the bottom right-hand corner is a little thing from Ebony Magazine about Booker T and the MGs not showing up for this concert in Peoria. So I interviewed a few people about Beatty's Barn, a few people who were there, who saw these shows, and were able to tell me about watching James Brown and being right. And one guy caught his bow tie when he threw it out into the crowd. Little tidbits like that. So I was really excited to write an article. Well, then I started talking about other things because I'm a music fan, and so like, oh yeah, Jackson 5 played here in the 60s, right? Oh, I was at that, St. Pat's, 1969. One thing led to another, and all of a sudden I'm talking to other people, and on the left is the flyer, the one piece of evidence that I know of that is that shows that they were here. This was May of 1969 at St. Pat's Hall. On the right is an article by Pam Adams that was published in 1984 talking about how the Jackson 5 were here. And if you read that article, it's interesting because it's only 15 years after the fact, but already the history was very fuzzy. She's like, they might have played here twice. They might have played here. I know they played here twice. They might have played here 3 times. Maybe they did this. Maybe they did that. So you can tell even 15 years after the fact, that history is already being buried. So I was interviewing folks, and it quickly grew beyond an article about Beatty's Barn, and eventually I realized, okay, I think this is a book. And part of my motivation for this is, everyone knows about REO Speedwagon and Dan Fogelberg from Peoria, but nobody knows about not only these shows that took place at Beatty's Barn, but about the soul and jazz and funk bands that came out of Peoria that were from right here. And so I decided to try to rectify that. I had also, at the magazine, when I was editor-in-chief, I had interviewed folks like Jimmy Binkley, who's no longer with us, John Phillips, jazz pianist. I'd interviewed Preston Jackson many times, a guy named Cecil Grubbs, who was a really wonderful jazz drummer, just passed away last year. So I had this material, and I was friends with a lot of these folks, and so I just started talking to them and interviewing them. And so the book that I'm working on now focuses on soul, jazz, blues, R&B, essentially Black music. And it also touches on gospel and hip hop and all those kind of musical tributaries that flow in and out of soul music. And so I worked really hard to put together an outline. I contacted University of Illinois Press because I'd already worked with them, and we were very successful there, and they were interested. And so I went through the proposal process with them. I had to put together a formal proposal, 2 sample chapters, a very detailed outline, and then a 10-page kind of essay that answers a bunch of questions that they had. So that took a few months to put together. I finished that in January. And then in April or May, they said that it's a go. And then in June, I signed the contract. So I have a contract with the University of Illinois Press for this new book. And so this is where I'm at right now, is the messy middle. I am working through, my outline changes every day, because as the more people that I talk to, I hone it, I find out new facts, I realize, oh, that's actually not right, or this isn't as important as that, and it goes. So I've never written this way before. I have a word count, I have 90,000 words, and have to fit all of this stuff into 90,000 words. And it sounds like a lot, but it's a pretty broad scope. I'm going back all the way to the 1930s, to the big band era, up to the beginning, or up to the present day, in a sense. But it's not a comprehensive history. There's not enough space to marshal all of those facts. And so what I'm trying to do is just build a story that's going to be interesting for folks, for people who weren't there, who maybe don't know these bands. And this was a guiding principle for my first book as well, that you don't have to know who these bands were or who these people are to find it interesting. And so a lot of the research that I did at the beginning, I had to eventually cut some of that. I went back into vaudeville, even into the 1800s, just trying to find the roots of music. And I had a little bit more on rock and roll, and a lot of that stuff is probably not going to end up making the final cut, just because of the word count. And so those are some of the challenges that I have. I've got this broad scope. I can't go super deep on any one topic. I'll tell you, there's 10 or 15 books that I could write out of the material that I've collected, out of the folks that I've interviewed. For this book alone, I've interviewed more than 75 people already just in the past year. And and any number of them could have, their own chapter or whatnot. So I'm trying to also balance the broader cultural context, the story of Peoria, how Peoria fits into events over the years, the musical history of that. It's an academic press, so I also have to create a story that is accessible, but yet also something that a professor can use in their course on cultural history, which actually Punks in Peoria is being used as a book in several college courses around the country. So I've proven that I can do it, and then on the primary material is very limited. Like I said, there's hardly any coverage of this in the newspaper. And then, I have to connect with folks for interviews. I know a lot of people, and then you talk to people and they lead you to other people, but it's still, I've sent lots of Facebook messages and texts and random voicemails to folks like, hey, you don't know me, but I'm working on this book about Peoria music and I really want to talk to you. And so I've had a lot of great reception, and then I've got a lot of people that I'm still waiting to hear from, or waiting to figure out how I can connect with them. And then of course, time is always a challenge. I did want to connect a little bit with the Peoria Reads book, since that's the basis of this series. The book focuses on 11 different artists. And from what I can tell, I believe 3 of them played in Peoria. Buddy Guy has played here recently, but supposedly he also played at Collins Corner in the early 1960s. And I'll talk about Collins Corner in a second. But there's no way to really confirm that because there are no flyers. Of course, nothing was in the newspaper. Bob Dylan played here, of course, not too long ago. I just saw him. And then Mavis Staples. This came out of my research for the book. So not only did Mavis Staples play here about 5 or 6 years ago at the Blues Festival, but when she was with the Staples Singers, they came through all the time. They were right up in Chicago. And the gospel scene in Peoria is off the charts. You could write a book just on the gospel music scene in Peoria. And that's what one of the big things that I've discovered in this book. So Staples Singers played at Carver Center at least 3 different times. Well, 2 of these are Carver Center. 1 is at Rising Sun Baptist Church. 3 different times, 59, 62, and 67. I'm pretty sure they played more than that. I've heard that they have a connection to a particular Baptist church here in Peoria, and that they may have even had some kind of house in Peoria or something. This is something I'm still trying to figure out. So if you happen to know anyone that knows this, let me know. But one of the other people who's profiled in the book is Charlie Parker. And I thought that maybe he played in Peoria. I went back and researched all of what I could find of his concert dates. And the best I could figure out was before he went to New York City and basically started the bebop revolution, he was in a band called the Jay McShann Band, and they were out of Kansas City. And Jay McShann Band played in Peoria in the fall of 1942. However, so I thought, all right, I found it. Charlie Parker played in Peoria. However, in another piece, I found that Charlie Parker left the band, I believe, a month before that gig. So I don't think that he actually did. But these are the kinds of mysteries that that I love solving. And there's hundreds of them with this book. I heard rumors that Billie Holiday once holed up in Peoria when she was getting away from trying to kick her addiction. I don't know whether or not that's true. It's not going to go in the book unless I can find more proof about that. But all these tantalizing little tidbits of information I tracked down to the best of my ability, but that's going back pretty far. Part of the research for my book involved reading other books. And the Miles Davis autobiography, there's a mention of Peoria in that. He talks about in the winter of 1959, he takes his quintet. They have a 2-week gig in Chicago. John Coltrane is in the band. And he talks about how his buddy Darnell drove his bus up from Peoria and parked it outside the apartment for 2 weeks. And they hung out. I'm like, all right, who is this Darnell guy? So I'm looking in the book. It never mentions his last name, nothing like that. I contacted the Miles Davis house in East St. Louis, and they put me in touch with the St. Clair Historical Society, but they also put me in touch with Miles Davis's nephew. They're like, he's going to give you a call. So he called me, and I was real excited. And he was like, so I told him kind of what I was looking for. He was like, yeah, I remember Darnell. I'm like, okay, yeah, what was his last name? I don't remember his last name. Like, okay, all right. He's like, well, maybe my mom will. So he put his mom on the phone, who was, or no, his aunt, who was Miles's daughter, Cheryl. So she got on the phone. She's like, what do you want to know about Darnell for? I'm like, well, I tried to explain. She also couldn't remember his last name, but they confirmed that Darnell existed. Turns out I went to it was the guy from the St. Clair Historical Society who went back through the yearbooks and found it was Darnell Moore. So I'm like, okay, now I've got a last name. I go to the Journal-Star archives. There's no record of any Darnell Moore. There's nothing about him anywhere. So it's kind of a dead end. I had to just kind of give it up at that point. But you never know what one of these leads is going to actually turn into something and what you're going to have to give up. I was trying to find some of the early Louis Armstrong tour dates when he might have played in Peoria, because the first date that I knew about was in the early 50s. And the Journal-Star archives, the digital archives, only go back to 1952 or 1951. So I checked out these two books on the bottom left there from the library, looking for Peoria references. There were none. And so I contacted the author, who is the research archivist at the Louis Armstrong House Museum. And he gave me two different dates where Louis played in Peoria. One was in 1942, the other was in 1936. And I was like, ooh, okay. So he gave me exact dates, and it was actually an article in the Chicago Defender that talked about somebody drove down from Chicago to watch Louis Armstrong play in Peoria. I'm like, that's awesome. So I go to the microfilm and I start looking, nothing. Louis Armstrong plays in Peoria. There's no coverage in the newspaper. And this is, 1936 was a while ago, but it was after him being a pretty well-known name. And so you would think that the newspaper might have written about it. I haven't had a chance yet to look for the 1942. I'm expecting that there will be something there, but I just haven't had the time to look for it yet. And then the third book over there is Clark Terry's autobiography. And he devotes a whole 2 to 3 pages about Peoria because he was in Peoria on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And so he talks about kind of what the scene was like. And he talks a little bit about he was playing at this club, the Granada Club, that Brisk Collins owned. I mentioned Collins Corner. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. So book research, I must have checked out 100 different books over the last year looking for Peoria references. Ike Turner, in his memoir, he opens up a chapter talking about how he was driving to Peoria, Illinois when JFK was assassinated. I'm looking for a way to kind of squeeze that in into the book, but I'm not sure that it's going to probably just end up being one of those random facts that doesn't make it. God bless libraries. Archival research, so important. Um, and, this is our history. And, I have major concerns with, with digital technology and how easily history can be erased and manipulated. And we're seeing that today. But I love digging into the archives. On the right-hand side I found this somehow through keyword research. Son House was a Delta blues guitarist, and he did an interview. And at the very bottom, you can see it says Johnny Price, Peoria. His stepbrother apparently lived in Peoria. And I'm like, okay, this is an interesting thing. I contacted the Library of Congress, and they have this, but it's going to cost me some money in order to get the audio recording, and so that's kind of temporarily on hold right now, because I'm not sure whether or not it's going to actually have any information that's going to be beneficial to the book. So we got to kind of watch that. But on the left-hand side is a leftist newspaper from the late 60s, and they have digital copies of this in some library in New York. And I wasn't sure how I was going to make it out there. I forgot that I have a buddy who is a librarian in the state of New York. And I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and he was able to get the microfilm. So he is in the process of scanning all of this for me. And this is just kind of I don't know what's going to be on it. There may be nothing that's helpful to my book, but there very well may be, because this newspaper came out in 1968, and right in the thick of the Black Power movement and civil rights era, and so I have no idea what's going to be on that. But again, I'm very thorough, and I try to track down everything that I possibly can. This was a newspaper from that same time period, 1968 to 69. It was published by the Afro-American Federation of, I'm blanking on the name right now, but organization. They were around about 5 years. If you remember James Polk, he was a city councilman and he was a Peoria County board member. He founded this organization in 1967. And they published this newspaper, The Black Rapper. Through my research online, I learned that they had this on microfilm at the Abraham Lincoln Museum in Springfield. And so one day, May and I went down there, and I scanned all of the images from that. And there's a lot of stuff in there that is very interesting. And there was, in fact, a one-page profile about Judy Page. If you know Judy, singer around town, she was Judy Stokes at that time. But I found that to be very interesting. And then the other thing I was going to mention, there's the blues archives at the Harold Washington Library in Chicago. And I really, really want to go there. I know that there is stuff in there that it relates to Peoria that would be really helpful to my book. However, the finder key for this archive is a 3-ring binder. It's 25 years old, and all of the material has been shuffled around, and nothing is in the place where it should be. And it's all back behind in the stacks, back behind the desk. You can't just search through it or anything. And so I kind of have just given up on that. I've talked to a few blues experts in Chicago, and they basically said, don't even bother, because you're just not going to find what you're looking for. I am, however, going to the University of Chicago, their special collections, because they have some material that I'm interested in, and also the Chicago History Museum does. So planning a trip to Chicago at some point for that. So in my keyword research, I also discovered that Pedro Bell, who is the bottom left-hand corner there, he is the visual artist who created most of the album covers for Funkadelic in the 1970s. He went to Bradley for one semester, maybe a little more than one semester. But he came here, it was 1969. He met Mark Clark, who was a Peorian who was in the Black Panther Party, and he was selling newspapers, selling newspapers at Bradley. And so I found numerous interviews with Pedro Bell online where he talks about coming to Bradley, being in Peoria, and he basically said that he was kicked out of school for associating with the Black Panthers. Excuse me. So I was just fascinated. I'm a huge Parliament-Funkadelic fan, and I had no idea. Again, another thing, I'm like, how did I never know this? I just astounded me. Lonnie Johnson, incredible blues guitarist, lived in Peoria for several years in the 1930s. And his story is really interesting. I found this out through initially through keyword research. He had traveled to England in 1917. He was from New Orleans originally. He came back from England to discover that his entire family, except for one brother, had died of the flu in the Spanish flu epidemic. And his family was very large. He had like 12 brothers and sisters, and they were all dead. He and his brother moved to St. Louis, and he became one of the biggest artists of the Harlem Renaissance. He was the second biggest blues musician of the day, next to Blind Lemon Jefferson. And he was so important, like Bob Dylan devoted 3 or 4 pages just to Lonnie Johnson in his first memoir. So when the Depression hits, the stock market crashes, the record industry just completely tanked. And he lost his record contract. He went back to St. Louis for a while. And then he ended up, he played, or he worked for the railroad in Galesburg for a while. Then he came to Peoria and worked in a steel mill, which I think was Keystone, not 100% sure. But he also talks about playing taverns in Peoria when he was working at the steel mill. He also did yard work for a country club. I think it was Mount Holly, but it's very unclear exactly when haven't been able to figure out even what years he was in Peoria. I just know that he was. And so, and I can't go into his story too in depth, but he has multiple, he comes back in the 1940s. He has a #1 R&B hit in 1947. He's in Chicago. Then he disappears again in the 50s, and then he's rediscovered again in the 1960s. He was a janitor in Philadelphia. And so it's just really fascinating to me how his story kind of goes all over the place, but Peoria has this little piece of it. This is a picture on the right. This is not the Faust Club. This is a club on the south side of Chicago, 1942. But the band that's playing is Boyd Atkins Orchestra. And Boyd Atkins was from Paducah, Kentucky. He played on the riverboats in the 1920s and joined Louis Armstrong's band in the late 20s. And he's the author of the famous song Heebie Jeebies. He wrote that song. And he played for 4 years in Peoria during World War II. They were the house band at the Faust Club. And so the Faust, I put this photo in because it gives you an idea of kind of what the shows were like at that time. They had dancers, they had comedians, there was always an MC who introduced all the acts. And then on the left there is an actual ad from the Faust Club from the 42, 43, Snookum Russell's orchestra playing here, and they were like a 12 or 13 piece band. So the bands at that time were, very large and that, so very interesting. Prince Eugene Stinson is a very important person from Peoria. You may have heard of him in any number of capacities. He was a magician by trade. That poster in the middle I got from Steve Spain. That was a magic show that they did in the 1970s. He came here in the early 30s. He opened up a club called the Paradise Club, and that's in the upper left-hand corner. Over on the right is an early picture of him in his magic show. And then in the bottom there is a ticket, some sort of ticket. But he was very important. He brought lots of bands to Peoria in the 40s and 50s. Blues acts, jazz bands. He was really close friends with B.B. King, for example. And so he was a guy that made things happen. He had these street dances down on the south side of Peoria every 4th of July. They would close off the streets and have huge bands and just revelry. And also his sons were very important as well. So John Stinson, you may know, is the former police chief, the first African-American police chief in Peoria. And then another one of his sons was Sonny Stinson, and he was a bebop band leader who played at a lot of the clubs in the 50s and the 60s. And he was good friends with Richard Pryor and kind of in that time period. So he plays a big role in my book. Then you got Jimmy Bell. Jimmy Bell was born in Peoria and died in Peoria, born in 1910. He was a boogie woogie blues piano player. He led bands ranging from a trio to a 13-piece orchestra. And then at the end of his career, he played Peoria piano bars solo. And he was also a notorious criminal. I've talked to several musicians that played with him, and they're all scared of him. He served multiple prison sentences. In 1953, he was busted for narcotics. And Dickie Pryor, Richard Pryor's uncle, was his partner in that. And that is what on the right-hand side there, Dickie Pryor got arrested in Peoria. Jimmy Bell escaped to St. Louis, but then the FBI found him and brought him back. So he served some time then. He served time later in the 60s. In 1959, the state of Illinois said he was the #1 dope peddler in the entire state. Also a fantastic musician. This is Collins Corner. And again, shout out to the library. This is from the special collections that they have preserved this. This is just north of the bridge, right across from Taft Homes. The corner of Eaton and Washington Street is where this club was. And this is where, it's actually the second club that Richard Pryor got his start. He started out at Harold's Club, which was just 3 blocks down the street, and then he moved over to Collins Corner. That neighborhood on North Washington Street was incredibly dynamic and went back to the 1800s. And it was mostly Black neighborhood. And of course, when they decided to put the interstate in, they decimated that neighborhood. And so Richard Pryor's early home and a lot of these clubs got demolished to put the bridge in. Now, Collins Corner actually managed to stay around for a little bit longer. And so this picture, I believe, 1965. So it's pretty much almost at the end of its existence. But the owner, Brisk Collins, I could give a lecture just on Brisk Collins. Incredibly interesting person. He had connections to Al Capone, Chicago gangsters. He ran a numbers racket in Peoria. He was also up in Chicago doing that. He briefly owned a club up there. A whole lot of stuff that I'm trying to find out more about, but a lot of it went to the grave with him. He was mentioned in the Kefauver investigations in 1951, the organized crime. And I actually there was a guy who wrote a book about Chicago, the Chicago Black gangsters up there, the Jones brothers. And Brisk Collins is mentioned multiple times in this book. And so I contacted him to see if he might know anything else. And he was actually like fascinated to hear from me because he didn't know much about Brisk Collins. So I shared all of my research with him. And he told me that there's a guy he's in touch with who has a whole bunch of photos in his attic in Chicago. And he believes Brisk Collins is in there and other things. So this is another lead that I'm trying to track down. And I also interviewed a woman who was married to his cousin, and she lives now just at the Benai Brith apartments there by the Civic Center. And she gave me a whole host of information. She was very young when she married his cousin. And so she was there in the rooms when they're playing cards and gambling and talking this and that. So she was able to tell me a whole lot about her firsthand experience being there. And what's interesting about Briss was, yes, he was involved in criminal activities, but he was a very complex figure. He was very generous. He was a really a good man in many ways. He once ran into a burning building and saved a baby from a fire, and that was documented in the Journal Star. He used to do these Easter egg hunts, and he would put $100 bills in 5 of the Easter eggs, so all of the kids would go hunt for Easter eggs, and a few of them would get really lucky. This was the Hi-Fis were essentially the first R&B band in Peoria, and I had never heard of them until I embarked on this journey of research. The first person that I got in touch with and interviewed, his name is Governor Foreman, and I've interviewed him now 3 or 4 times. And he told me about the Hi-Fis. I didn't realize even at the time how significant they actually were. But they formed in the late 50s, and there's so many interesting stories, and I probably need to pick up the pace here a little bit. But one interesting story is they backed up the Jackson 5 in Gary, Indiana, before, actually even before they were the Jackson 5, they weren't called the Jackson 4, but before Michael even joined. At that time, you would have traveling bands that would just back up singing groups and that sort of thing. So, and it wasn't just the Jackson 5, Sugar Pie DeSantos and many other R&B artists that they backed up. And then they also were the house band at the Elks here in Peoria. And so 3 of them are still alive, and I've been able to make contact with all of them. So in addition to Governor, the saxophone player, Roy C. Farmer, he started the band, and he lives down at Southside Manor, and I've visited him a few times. And then, another guy that I interviewed, I tracked him down. He's in a nursing home in East Peoria, and I just had to go there and knock on his door, and I was like, hey, are you the same Bill Allen that was the bass player for the Hi-Fis 60 years ago? And he just, looked up at me stunned. He's like, yeah. And I went in, sat down on his bed, and we talked for an hour. I've been back 2 other times to talk to him. And then in a completely separate interview, I was interviewing the daughter of of a woman who's in another band. And it turns out she was married to Bill Allen briefly in the early 60s. And her daughter, who I was talking to, so that was her stepdad. She hadn't seen him since they had a falling out. She hasn't seen him since the early 60s. And I was like, I just talked to him last week. I can tell you where to find him. And so I haven't talked to her since, but she was supposed to go see him last week. So I'm very curious to find out, how that reunion went. But it's like moments like that that are just that really make this all worth it. And Wild Child Gibson is probably a name some people know. He came here in 1959, and he stayed the rest of his life. And he played. He was one of the Peoria's well-known musicians at that time. And this particular band, he's playing with Chuck Bonner on drums and Steve Degenford on guitar. Some of you may know them. Wild Child, really interesting guy. He was Little Richard's first tour manager for about a year. He toured around with Little Richard. He got shot on tour in New Orleans, and Ray Charles happened to be there and helped bandage him up. And I was skeptical of this story, but I've gone to multiple sources, and it seems to be true. So that's going in the book. But he was he played here all up until his death in 1994. Really popular organist. Marva and the Soul Progressives. The singer Marva Jones was in a band called the Volcanoes, and they were one of the first rock and roll / R&B bands. They put out a 45 in 1959 called Cherry Pie, which was kind of a little bit of a hit. This band came later. This is later in the 60s. 2 of the guys, Sydney and Clarence, were in the Hi-Fis before this. And you can tell that this is the late 60s. If you look at Clarence, he's kind of got that hippie headband on and that. But I'm really curious about Phyllis on the left here, a female guitarist in this band, the only white person in this band. And I've been trying to find out who this person was. When I was talking to Marva's daughter, she told me that Phyllis is from Tremont. I'm like, oh, okay. Because I don't have a last name. So now I know that she's from Tremont. Last week, I contacted the Tremont Historical Society and said, hey, this woman named Phyllis, I'm trying to find out more about. Haven't heard back yet, but if I don't hear back from them, I'll probably go look in the yearbooks and try to find her last name, because apparently she was very, very good. And I just think it's interesting. And most of the other folks I've managed to identify in some way. So part of this is the book is not about any one band or any one person, but what I find fascinating is all of these connections over time. So a lot of you have probably seen Preston Jackson, Judy Page, Dave Parkinson, Steve Dagenford, I mentioned. These are all folks who are still with us, still active, playing music together. And they've been playing music together in various incarnations over the years, over the past 40 years. So up in the right, left-hand corner, that's Preston Jackson and the Rhythm Aces. In the upper right-hand corner is Crisscross, and Preston and Judy and Dave Parkinson there with the saxophone. They all played in this band. Some of you might have seen them. They were around from about 1976 to the early 80s. Incredible jazz, fusion, funk band. And it brought all of these people together. Alvin Butler was the drummer, incredible drummer. The bottom left corner is a picture of Dave Parkinson playing with James Brown. He moved to Cincinnati in the mid-60s, and he recorded with James Brown on multiple records. Tim Drummond actually was another local musician from Canton who played with James Brown, and not only played with him on record, but toured Vietnam and Africa with James Brown. He was the first white musician to play in James Brown's band. And James Brown is quoted as intentionally doing that because it was a very heated time for race relations in the country, and he wanted to and this was not the only thing that he did to try to calm down some of those the more difficult aspects of what was happening at the time. But you got the guy with the saxophone there in the bottom left is the same guy with the saxophone in the upper right. And there's a Journal Star article from, I think, 1987. And then the other article there that says Move Over Ella, that's Judy Page with Gail Thomas. And Gail Thomas was an incredible singer who came out of Peoria. She was the singer for Dave and the Dynamics, another band from the 80s and 90s, and was also with the Jazz Society band. Incredible voice. There were 4 or 5 really incredible funk bands in Peoria in the 70s. And these are just a few of them. P-Town Connection, they were around in the late 70s, early 80s, and they came out of another band called Second Time Around. They had horns, and actually the guitarist Stan Burns still plays in bands around here. ABB Plus, that's Alexander Brothers band plus. So there were 4 Alexander brothers. 2 of them are still active playing in bands today. Just talked to one of them the other day, and that's them in the middle there. And I was able to find these photos by just searching on Facebook and searching different keywords, and I was able to find some of that. But some of the other bands that were around then, a band called New Breed that came out of Taft Homes. I mentioned Second Time Around. Good and Plenty was like a 10 piece band with horns, and I'll be talking about the leader of that band was John Kelly. He was a trumpet player. He was also a pretty well-known barber here in town, and his son Tim is Tim Kelly from Tim and Bob, who is a R&B production duo, and we'll get to them in a minute. One of the chapters talks about the blues in Peoria, and especially in the late 80s and into the 90s, there was a really large blues scene here in Peoria. There was a club called Duff's Rooftop, that's in what is now Hearth, used to be Duffy's, and they had amazing blues bands play there from 1987 to 1989. They were around about 3 years. So on the left here, you've got Eddie King. And this guy, you talk about tragedy with the blues. He came out of the west side of Chicago. He was playing with Howlin' Wolf and, all of those guys that were in the Chicago blues scene. He was at a gig in, I think it was 1964 or 65. His house caught on fire while he was playing a gig. All 5 of his children died. And he and his wife, Bessie, moved to Peoria shortly after that. Partly for cheaper cost of living and just to get away and do different things. They ended up having more children and also more tragedy. And I won't get into all the details, but incredibly soulful singer, guitarist, and just the more that I find out about him, the more fascinated I am. with him, and I've talked to some of the people that played with him, and they're all like really devoted to him. And so, and there's, you can find performances on YouTube in that. In the middle, you got Luther Allison. He's the most famous blues musician who had ties to Peoria. He came here in 1967, started working at Caterpillar, worked a little bit at Keystone. Meanwhile, every weekend he's driving to Chicago to play blues gigs. So he would get off work, drive to Chicago, play Saturday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, drive back, get back into town early Monday morning, and then clock in at Caterpillar a few hours later. And he did this for several years. He said in 1 year he put 20,000 miles on his car just going back and forth to Chicago, which I calculated would have been like 65 trips back and forth to Chicago in 1 year. Anyhow, he was the first blues artist that was signed to Motown in the early 70s, but Motown didn't really know what to do with him. They didn't promote him very well, so his records didn't do that well. And he ended up moving to France because he, the American scene just wasn't appreciating how great he was. When he moved to France was when his career really started taking off. He's huge in Europe. And eventually that came back to the US too. So in the early 90s, he had a major comeback. He was back in the States, and he played at the Madison Theater a few times. His kids grew up partially in Peoria, partially in other places, but Bernard Allison is an incredible blues musician of his own right, beyond just blues, but he went to Richwoods here, and I just interviewed him a few weeks ago, and just a really nice guy. Luther Allison, incredible person. He also tragically died young of cancer. He found out about a month before he died. He had a whole tour planned. This was the summer of '97, and Bernard picked up his tour and played all the rest of his dates, learned all, knew all of his songs, and played all of that. But another like really, really incredible guy, dedicated to the blues, dedicated to his craft, but also dedicated to his wife and his family. And I'm breaking up because I literally was talking to Luther Allison Jr. last week. Good guy, and we're talking about maybe setting up some kind of concert here in Peoria when the book comes out. On the right is the cover of the poster for the first blues festival in Peoria. Now it's the Blues and Heritage Festival, I think, but at the time, it started in 1989, and Butch Duffy, who owned Duff's Rooftop, that I was just talking about, he's the true founder of that. That's Coco Taylor on the cover there, and there are 4 different Peoria musicians that had a ties with Coco Taylor. Eddie King played with her. He was her guitar player for about 10 or 15 years. Bernard Allison, as soon as he graduated from Richwoods, he became her guitarist, and he went on tour with her for about 3 years. Frank Alexander, who was in the band that I showed earlier, ABV Plus, amazing drummer. He played with her for about 7 years. And then Maestro Sanders, another blues artist. I know I'm just rattling off all of these names, but it's just interesting how all of these Peorians ended up in Coco Taylor's band. And I talked to this guy in Chicago who was the founder of Living Blues magazine, really big guy in the blues scene. He actually recorded a full album of Maestro Sanders in 1985. It was never released. And so we're talking, he really wants to put it out. And so I was like, well, no better time than when this book comes out, let's put the Maestro Sanders record out too. And so the book covers a little bit into hip hop. And this is a band called Daughter Bright and the Soda Pop Mikes. Mike Alexander was one of the first, probably the first hip hop artist from Peoria. Started rapping in the late 70s, and that's him with his family. His daughter and 2 sons were in this group with him. And these are all 3 pictures of Mike Alexander and his kids. And so on the left there is an album cover. They actually put out a record on a major record label in 1989. And then at the right is them with Kid and Play. They opened up for Public Enemy in Chicago. They went on tour. They did some Nintendo tour. at the time. He's still in Peoria. Talked to him. Really, really interesting guy. He does faith-based hip hop now. And I also wanted to mention Rumpy, who's not pictured, but he is another guy, one of the very first hip hop guys in Peoria. He was a break dancer. He was a rapper. He was Eddie King's son, and he actually Eddie King, the bluesman, from a couple slides ago. And they actually died 2 days apart from one another in 2012. And that whole story is very tragic as well. But I don't get full on into hip hop in the book, but I do really talk about the early years and some of those pioneers that that kind of started the hip hop scene here in Peoria. And that's a whole other angle that could be its own book, just the hip hop scene in Peoria. And then Tim and Bob, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Good and Plenty, Tim Kelly, his dad was John Kelly, the trumpet player from that band. And then Bob Robinson came out of New Morning Star Church, and they had a band that they played in this church, and they got to be friends, and they learned how to produce records. And they ended up moving to, well, Bob moved up to Detroit because the church that Aretha Franklin's dad used to minister at needed a sound person, and he moved up and worked with them. Then he and Tim got together, and they were a production duo from the early 90s up until I think 2014 was when they finally kind of severed ties amicably. But they, and a lot of Peorians don't know about them. I talked to someone last night that I thought for sure would have, it's like, I just mentioned Tim and Bob offhand, and they're like, who's Tim and Bob? They produced 5 songs on the Boys to Men album on the right-hand corner, which was the biggest selling R&B record of all time. That was one of their first things that they ever did. They produced TLC. They worked with Madonna, Cisco, Case, Bobby Valentino, dozens and dozens of artists. And many famous producers, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, Babyface. They've got 3 Grammy Awards, 12 nominations, hundreds of millions of albums sold that they produced. And it all started here in Peoria for them. And so I took a little bit of time away from writing the book and doing interviews and research to put this together and to talk to you because I couldn't resist the connection with the Peoria Reads program. I'm supposed to finish this book by May is when I'm supposed to turn this in. I'm really excited to announce that Preston Jackson is going to do the artwork for the cover, and he is also writing the foreword. I've been working with him over the past year, just kind of keeping him filled in with what I'm working on. And we just talked last night about that. I'm talking to the museum, possibly doing some kind of exhibit there, possibly working into their Rum Boogie on the Plaza summer series that they have, because there's a really good tie-in there. I've had a few talks with some record labels about maybe putting some of this out on vinyl or CD. And then, you know, I literally have like 15,000 files in this folder from the research that I've uncovered. So much material that's never going to make the book. And so whether it's on social media or whether I create a website, there's going to be some other kind of element beyond just the book so that I can, you know, share this stuff. It's really important to me that this history gets shared because it has been buried. You know, if you go into the museum and you see the wall of records there, Golden Voice recording studio out of Pekin, you know, incredible story, great bands, really cool. It's been well documented, but this is a side of history that people don't know about, and that I think they need to. And so I'm working on that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here. And I know we're at time, but I would be happy to take any questions if anyone has anything. Sorry for my long ramblings, but
That was so wonderful. Thank you.
thank you. It's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. My wife can attest to me rambling about like really obscure details that of bands from 70 years ago that have no idea. Um, but this was actually like really fun for me to get this out of my head and to talk to people about it, people who care. Obviously, you showed up, so thank you for coming. And I do have copies of my book, Punks in Peoria, for sale if you're interested in that. It's going to be a little bit before the new book comes out, but yeah. Yeah. So we celebrate Big Spider. Oh yeah. From that. Yeah. So let's go to Peoria now. There's one artist in Peoria that has a festival around. Who would it be? I'm going to go with Jimmy Baker. I don't know if anyone remembers Jimmy. He played at the Steakhouse for like 16 years. He played at Jimmer's for I think about that same amount of time. The last place he played was at Sky Harbor. He came to Peoria in 1960. He had been here many times before that on tour, but he settled here in 1960 and came with a four-piece band. One by one, the band members dropped off, and it ended up being Jimmy. But Jimmy was the guy that attracted all the musicians. They would all hang out around him. He taught them all so many things about just being a professional musician. He was an incredible person. He's pretty famous for towards the end of his life. He would every week would go out to nursing homes and play for free for people. But I found an article from the Northern Star in 1964 where he was talking about playing benefits for nonprofits. So this is something that he did over the course of his lifetime. Huge impact on a lot of musicians that are with us today. Jackson, for example. Yeah. And there's a few. He put out some records in the 50s. Just a really nice guy. I'm in touch with his stepdaughter. She has some stuff. Hoping to work with her on some of that. That would probably be my person. Yeah. No, okay. So Jackson 5, that was the second. Well, actually, before the concert in St. Pat's, they opened up the Crown Favorite at Expo Gardens. And I did talk to some of two people who were at that concert. One of them said they put Michael on a table because he was so short. You were there. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I know we talked on the phone, but that makes sense. Okay, yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even mention that. Yeah, well, okay. So this is another mystery I'm trying to solve. My friend Governor Orman told me John Kelly, he recorded on 8 millimeter film a bunch of their bands, shows, and things like that. Supposedly he recorded the Jackson 5 concert at St. Pat's. He's no longer with us, but his daughter lives in Peoria. His son Ted is a huge record executive. He's like vice president of the music for major record. Been trying to get an interview with him, haven't yet, but I'm expecting to do that next month. I'm hoping to get in touch with the daughter, have all this material to see if possibly, well, I'm interested in all of it. Back in 1969, that may be some of the very early footage of that. be incredibly valuable, not just to Peoria history, but to the history part of that. So that's another one of mine.
It seems like Peoria was just private. They had private, a lot of homegrown bands and a lot of really cool people coming through. I think we still have that, and if not, then why? Is it people don't see live music as much anymore?
Yeah, that's a huge topic that I'm wrestling with many different facets of. Because especially the last chapter, I don't want to end on a negative note. But a lot of this stuff is gone. And I don't want to be like, oh, back in my day, or things are all. But yeah, I mean, there's so many other things we do for our attention now. With our devices and the internet. We have the Civic Center, which is huge. But one chapter I talked about the Civic Center coming in. This is the first time that artists like Prince and Kenny Rogers were the first concert there. Big names to come to Peoria. People have friends with it. But in the process of creating the Civic Center, we also investigated a big chunk of downtown. Adjacent to the Civic Center, you know about the Southtown saga over the years. I've become really fascinated with that. Historical Society had a event last summer that was really interesting. And so many of the musicians, so many of the musicians that I'm really right in this part of town that, and I go through that all the time. It's now Drive, Quinn Avenue, out High Tower, so named after the incredible history. You have the Carver Center, you have Fort Chapel, you have the Baptist churches, but everything else, that all used to be single-family homes, small businesses on the corner. It was a thriving neighborhood, and those people were promised money from the city when they gave up their homes, and a lot of those promises were broken. They all had to move out. This took place over the course of but they destroyed a lot of those homes before they actually had money to rebuild there. And so that's just one example. I thought this a lot. And but some of it is just a lot of these clubs, they were out there time, and so you can't bring that stuff back. So I don't want to say that it's better or worse. I think it's worse down now, but at the same time, we've got great actions. But it's there's a lot of politics and history there that it's very interesting to me, and it does tie directly to the positions that grew up in that neighborhood. Kind of an answer for you.
Thank you again. First book here, and we do have other Peoria-based programming. Over the next few months, you can find it on our website, or I pick up the paper calendar while you're here tonight. So I wanted to bring actually